Welcome to The Lost Signals Discusses Film and TV. Using the revolutionary Manzur-Ramosi Thurlow scale,
or MOTS,
we scrupulously review these art forms with an emphasis on narrative structure. Join us for another entertaining episode.
Hello. And we may be attempting to be the Lost Signals reviews, film and television, but in reality, this is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and we are all just puppets in his land of make-believe.
Indeed.
I am Jonathan Ian Manser, here with our balding producer, Stephen Ramosi.
Well, thanks for coming to the podcast, neighbor.
Our cynic, soon to become a optimist, Scott Thurlow.
Mr. Rogers is definitely hiding something, and I'm going to prove it.
And our own manic pixie Rogers, Christopher Morgan.
Hello, that's very logical what you just said.
And obviously we are doing a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And what a beautiful day.
Oscar contender and
Yeah. So, all right, Scott, would you like to go in with the plot?
Sure. In the most broadest terms possible, a man is estranged from his father. He happens to be a journalist, gets an assignment to do a sensible puff piece on Fred Rogers, becomes fairly friendly with Fred Rogers, and via that relationship reconciles with his father at the end of the movie. That's pretty much it. It's based on a true story. Like, apparently, like, this guy like was a writer for Esquire or whatever, like in the movie it's Esquire, and he was assigned to cover, like, do a little interview with Fred Rogers, ended up forming a rather friendly, like I said, relationship with him, and helped him through his own some troubles in his own personal life.
That's
pretty much it.
I was gonna say, at some point, he becomes almost scarily enamored with Mr. Rogers, like in the middle.
Well, everyone does.
There is early on when he's first starting to interview him, he does suspect, like, oh, this guy can't be like the guy he seems, but apparently, like, Mr. Rogers is indeed the person that we all know and love, and was the nicest guy as everyone thinks he is.
But not only is he a nice guy, he's somewhere along the lines of a saint, a Buddha, a
spiritual guide of some sort.
Almost supernatural figure. I love the magical realism that goes into this, that Mr. Rogers is bigger than life. He is a calming presence. He warp almost like a cult-like figure, but not malicious.
Yeah,
He
not
is
menacingly.
Yeah. Chris, you seem poised.
Yeah, I was going to say, because his wife didn't like the fact that he was called a saint. And the movie did a great job of pointing out that this is a flawed man. I mean, I guess we'll get to it later, but he said that how he copes with things is, his wife said that, he reads scripture, he goes for a swim, and he said when he gets really frustrated, he slams the piano. So he admits he's flawed. It's just like his wife admits
he doesn't like being seen as a saint.
Right. But the movie also shows that even if he doesn't tell you, he demonstrates by these things that have been set up, for lack of a better word. You do see him reading scripture and then cutting to him swimming while he's saying, God, pray for this person, this person. And then at the end, where he is trying to play piano, can't get it right, slams the piano and then goes into playing it. And they did a really good job of saying that he is a flawed man, and that he himself demonstrates the fact that he does deal with these emotions. He's not this saint.
But what I think the important part of what you're saying is that Mr. Rogers this is not a movie about Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
This is a movie about a man who's a cynic who is converted by a good man to become an optimist, to reconcile with
or at least
his family.
Get some of that optimism back into his life.
Yes. And Mr. Rogers is a supporting character in his own movie.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that it works perfectly for that, because this would not be a good movie if it was just focused on Mr. Rogers because you can deal with because they make him a larger than life character, it has a bigger impact on that scene when you're seeing that kind of the cracks in his foundation here and there. But you also see him as this saintly figure at the same time. But to my original point, though, that I think that the narrative structure of this movie, with the cynic becoming the optimist and the reconcile, actually is a fairly well done plot and is really a strength of this movie. That there's kind of a twofold narrative here, and then both narratives work for me.
Yeah, and it is a twofold narrative, but they fold those two stories into each other really well.
Yep, very
they
seamlessly.
start at first they kind of clash until Lloyd, the protagonist of the movie, starts to accept that he can't keep these parts of his life separate. Like that one is crashing in upon the other and forcing him to change.
He allows Rogers into his life.
Yeah. Let's see, it allows Rogers into his heart. Yep. Or the world's a better place.
At least for him, yeah, for sure. So, like you said, I think it was very well done narrative overall. Looking at a very strong 2. I could even be convinced of a 3, but I thought it wasn't like... I hate to say, like, not the strongest thing. It was very well constructed, for sure. No argument there. And like you said, E, I will back up the fact that I think it was a good decision, good idea to, in fact, make Lloyd, the journalist, like, he is the main character, whereas Mr. Rogers is sort of the most important, but certainly a secondary character. If you want to learn about Mr. Rogers' life, go watch the documentary, even though this is based on a true story that did happen in the late 90s of this writer meeting Mr. Rogers. But like I said, all I'm saying is that it was all well done throughout, and Steve-O, yes, they folded those two little, like, dynamics, like, elements of his life very well together to create a very well done narrative overall.
But making Mr. Rogers almost a tall tale, a legend versus the reality of it, makes it such more engaging story for
and more impactful,
the point that they're going for in this movie.
Agreed to that as well.
I mean, I don't see any reason to give it a 2. That's the thing is,
Like I said,
I
be
don't
convinced.
see there being like the main narrative thrusts work. There's certainly well established acts in this. Never was there a moment that that maybe even if it lost me a little bit, it always brought me back in quickly. And I think that the fact that they had the Mr. Rogers kind of secondary plot line as a larger than life figure, but still
grounded as well at the same time.
Well, that's the thing is, it's almost glimpses at reality, but his personality is so larger than life, is so steeped in legend that you only get the tiny glimpses in reality. And I don't even want to see those reality. I want to see him as this saintly figure.
Yeah.
I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that I'm probably going to give it a 3 as well. It's the narrative is strong. Both both parts of the narrative are strong. His interactions with Mr. Rogers and his interactions with his family both follow a really good narrative structure. And when they fold themselves into one another for the final act, I guess, it does a really good job of having Mr. Rogers come into his family's life and kind of having the same effect on that calming effect that he had, as you mentioned, as this figure that has kind of this effect on everybody that he meets on his whole family, but I like that, within the narrative, Lloyd has to mend his own bridges before he can let Mr. Rogers come in and be part of that. I think there's a lot to this plot that there's a lot of complexity that is made to look fairly easy.
Maybe not.
And I'm going to give it a pretty strong 3, actually, for that.
Actually, sorry, Chris, I knew you were just going to say the complexity angle. His relationship with his wife and child, the way that we perceive them as characters changes along with Lloyd's perception of them in his life. There's a lot of kind of working with secondary characters to influence, that we not only informed about Lloyd's opinion of the world, but we're informed about the characters around him too.
Oh, that's true.
I was right. Excuse me. I was right in Scott's camp, because I was telling Beth after the movie, I'm like, you have this really wonderful surrealistic element to it. And you phrased it better precast, but I was like, when you spent too much time away from him, I felt it came to an average melodrama. But as with Scott, I was coming here, I'm like, all right, I'm coming in with the strong 2. Can somebody convince me to a 3? And I realized that because what I would consider the average melodrama was informed by the magic of, for lack of a better word,
the enchantment.
the
perhaps we'll say.
enchantment of Mr. Rogers on this man. The melodrama was actually
Sort of elevated then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And to be honest with you, going into this thing, I really didn't want to see this movie because I figured it was a biopic. And to be honest with you, I've gotten to the point in time where it's just like you realize, when you research all this crap, you realize like how many biopics, how much is fictionalized. And I'm like, I got to the point where I was thinking about this. I'm like, what is the point of biopics anymore? And I was so pleasantly surprised to find out this wasn't a biopic. That
At least not a straight.
no,
Yeah,
and
one-to-one
they
ratio.
did some really creative stuff, which we'll get to when we get to style.
Mhm.
But you guys did it. I'm going to give this film a very strong 3. I thought narratively that it really makes sense coming here and listening to you and Steve-O talk about it, because I think I was right in Scott's camp. Really did say, like, it really did work for the narrative overall. So I'm giving it a 3.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna steal your move as well. You guys did, like I said, I wasn't dead set on it. That's sort of my initial reaction, and maybe I whatever like complaints I might have or kind of nitpicks. I think I did. I will say that there were like maybe 2 points tops in the film where like I thought like it sort of is not dragging, like became the generic melodrama.
Yeah.
But because of
Yeah.
all the things you guys just said, I think I will bump up to a 3 and give it a very strong score because the way it did sort of not negate them, but it did raise itself above the standard bar, and because of those elements and the Mr. Rogers magical thing, kind of the way they had that character work, I think is stronger than you might otherwise have seen.
And having a character, actually, almost, I'm going to double down on this, straight out of a kind of like a tall tale type thing, like this magical character that comes in to change people's lives. It's a tale as old as time in a lot of ways.
Sure,
But to make it fresh, to use a character I've known in my life,
sure, like modernized.
to have this kind of saintly-like figure, but still make him relatable and still make him... And the movie's poorer when he's not there, but we don't want too much of him either. They balance that perfectly.
No, you're right. I agree with that. That's why I'm bumping up to a 3. Everything you guys
Agreed.
said, like, sort of added, like, as I mulled it over as you were speaking, and you all make very good points and enough of them for me to give it a solid 3.
And I'm going to say as a final note, for me, there's a lot of nostalgia because, growing up in the 70s, you see a lot of Mr. Rogers being, my grandparents' generation. So a lot of their house reminded me of like,
I thought you were a guest on Mr. Rogers when you were a kid, weren't you?
no. No. But actually, there's a couple of two little tidbits that Romero is actually that he was in Pittsburgh. Romero worked on the Mr. Rogers show, and Childs, Keith David from The Thing was actually on Mr. Rogers too.
Cool.
But no, sitting there and seeing like when he's heating the baby bottle up, like we had that stove, we had the pots and pans and so forth. So there was a
Sure, there's that element to it.
There was a nostalgia to it, and also somebody who has daddy issues. I really needed
Speaking of daddy issues,
well, hold on one second. But the thing
So
is,
this is themes now.
the thing is, the reason I didn't want to give it a 3 offhand is because I wanted to, at my best, try to switch the objective narrative from the visceral,
To the academic more.
I just want to say that I came in with almost no nostalgia of Mr. Rogers. I didn't really watch it as a kid. If anything, I'm against sentimentality,
Yeah.
and I hate Tom Hanks.
That's been well
So
established.
there
Both of those
is-
things, sure.
This movie had everything going
Yeah.
against it, and I was very impressed.
But
and
see,
even by Tom Hanks.
but that was my point. Is I wanted to come in here with a 2, thinking I wanted to separate the viscera from the nostalgia.
Gotta separate the viscera,
but
always.
really just kind of like focus on the narrative. Focus on the narrative.
Mm.
And you guys, I'm going with the 2 because narratively, here's how I saw it. But as somebody who I think you and I both agree, I like Tom Hanks enough, but I'm kind of like sick of the biopic. And this, to me, when I first saw this, it looked like Oscar bait.
Sure. I mean, on paper, that's exactly what it seemed. So we were all sort of wary, like, oh, I guess we got to see this Mr. Rogers film. But we were seemingly all pleasantly surprised, and in fact, have agreed that it did a really good job on its plot.
because it was trying something new. But anyway, enough about the plot. Chris,
Speaking of daddy issues.
I'm not going to get into it.
Okay,
good. No, but I mean, this film there is numerous redemption arcs, but the thing I like about the redemption arcs is that they're not finite. That they make established through Mr. Rogers that we all are going through, that there is no one redemption arc for any one character in this film, for any one person. You have various attributes of your life, and I think this film kind of explored, even if it didn't go an in-depth exploration, it was a matter of dealing with issues, finding coping mechanisms, positive coping mechanisms, stuff that where it's okay to be in your own little world, so to speak, where like you have this anger, we have this resentment, but there needs to be some kind of objective force in your life that can actually kind of call you on your bullshit, for lack of a better word. And I think, no, as somebody who did grow up with Mr. Rogers, you know, I didn't appreciate him. I appreciated him more as I got older. Because I sit there and like, here's somebody who's calling this guy on his bullshit, but is himself flawed and is himself has coping mechanisms. So as a grander theme, this is going to sound like a cop out, but it's just like, it's being human and finding a way to get through every day. I mean, because we're always tasked with stuff that's going to seem like the end of the world for all of us. And maybe when somebody pulls you out of it, you realize that it's not. But to you, as a person, that is your world at that moment in time. That is the crisis moment. And to find ways to deal with that. I was thinking a lot about what we were talking about with JoJo, where a lot of it is about identity. Like there's a very strong, had themes for that too. It was a very strong, identity was a very strong thing. And I think this is part of that. It's like identity. It's like, it's a matter of how we identify, how we cope. And it's being able to learn from everything and to find out how we get to the next part.
So I'm going to make 2 points here. First is going back to a point I made earlier about this is rooted in kind of a classical tradition of a character comes into a person's life. He's almost a priest-like character who takes confession. He whispers to the father at the end on his deathbed to basically unburden, take the sins of the father and give him rest and peace by saying, I want you to pray for me because you're closest to God. There's a lot of religious similarities, but it's a character who comes in magical and then leaves the family at the end with the family reunited, a fractured family now reunited. But it's about forgiveness. It's about how to, like, while yes, there's a lot of modern sensibilities to this, it's still that kind of classic tale
rooted in that tradition.
Rooted in that tradition. And I think that they handled this very well. It's strange to me to think of this kind of character being Mr. Rogers, but I think that's actually perfect now that I like the deeper I think of it, because he can play that role of a person we all look up to and we think is a good person, playing an elevated role of that. And I guess I encompass the second point about forgiveness. There's also the classic thing, and I brought up that this reminded me of Big Fish quite a bit, in the sense that you have this cynic who finds a character who brings magical realism. And this leans a little bit more on the realism than the magical aspect.
But it still has a similar vein to it, for sure.
And that cynic, because you can't be a cynic if you weren't an optimist at one point. Yeah. Because cynicism is the loss of that optimism and finding redemption there. And I think that it handles this. And I'm a sucker for these kind of stories. So I'm giving it an incredibly strong one. Big Fish is one of my favorite movies of all time. And this has very similar themes to that, of that redemptive angle. So yeah.
Has a lot of connections. So you said a lot of it, Chris. I'm going to basically back you up to a large degree. Yes. The redemption arc thing I like because it wasn't like a clean redemption. Like, you know what I mean? It was messy as in real life is. And even, I believe there's a piece of dialogue towards the end that encapsulates the final point you made, where Mr. Rogers says something like, dying is part of being human. So if it's part of being human, it's mentionable, and if it's mentionable, it's manageable. And like you said, like with positive and healthy coping mechanisms, which also then might sort of dovetail, if you will, in reconciling your own life, and again, the fractured family relationships that were there, that were healed a bit via this intersection of lives. So yeah, I think I agree that it was all handled very well. It wasn't overly saccharine, which is something I was like sort of worried about going into it, but I think it was like subtly handled, but like obviously there, but without being too much one way or the other.
Because it's rooted in a traditional archetype.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the thing.
You're right. They use that like tradition, like you said, very well, and it works in sort of a modernized retelling of the figure, with Mr. Rogers being that figure.
Yeah.
So.
This is, and this has been partially said already, but a lot of this movie is about letting go. I know you mentioned forgiveness, but it's almost a different.
Part and parcel.
It's close, but even the Lloyd's father, Jerry, is kind of like, he's upset. He's like, I feel like I was just learning how to live, and now I'm dying. It's not fair, like it's kind of his story of learning to, life is what it is, and a lot of it is Lloyd letting go of the anger that he had at his father for, understandably, the anger that he had at his father for being a dick to him when he was, or to his mother, and kind of letting go. There's a scene where Lloyd is, I guess he like passes out or whatever, and he sees his mom and on her deathbed, and she says like, I know you think you're doing this for me, but you need to let it go.
Yeah.
And like that's one of the more powerful scenes I think in the movie, and like there's something really to be said for that specific thing. So
Almost a shamanistic trip.
Yes,
Right.
good call. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
You said
very
peace
much.
earlier. I think shaman is also a bit more fitting as well.
um,
Fits well.
but yeah, I think that's a strong theme as well, and of course everything that you guys talked about I agree with, so I'm gonna give it a strong one.
Yeah,
on
I
this
think it
one.
handles all that stuff very well, and again, not too forcefully one way or another, and it all very nicely fits in narrative and very strong one themes for me.
It's funny. I'm just gonna is the growing up a Trekkie, there's this ideal of this. There's this kind of ideal of a utopia, and then one of the reasons I love Deep Space Nine is because it challenges it. Hold on a second, I'm getting to somewhere.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. No. But this is me. But like in Deep Space Nine, Sisko once says, like about the Federation, it's easy to be a saint in paradise. And to me, like even in this film, you go to the magic land where King Friday the 13th, which I think is awesome, and Daniel's there, and you think this is kind of like the escapist land. To me, it's always been like this is kind of like the other world, and watching it. So like in this world, it's just like here's the escape. Here the land of where all
The
these
literal land of make believe.
where the land of make believe is, and you realize this isn't paradise. This is actually where you do a lot of the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think that Mr. Rogers constructed all these scenarios for broken people that he knew, so that every Mr. Rogers episode is actually an
Specifically
allegory
feeling-
to a specific person.
But it's also him. He's also
of course. It's all
constructed
tied
this
into
for.
it.
I mean, this is his coping mechanism as well. But what I'm saying is, and the reason I'm bringing this is because he's often revered as the saint, as this not this unintangible virtue of all of us. And you realize he's not, even in this fictional world he created in his neighborhood, the fictional world within his fictional world, the plan with the place with the king and Daniel is not even. It's like your dream state. It's where you work out internally things. And I appreciated that so much. Like I got more, as I grew up with this, I got more out of what Mr. Rogers was doing because of watching Lloyd go through all this stuff. And so, I mean, you do have the whole thing where it's like, oh, it's easy to be a saint. And like Mr. Rogers wasn't a saint and he was dealing with his own demons.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's just part of the theme. And I'm sorry to go off on a tangent, but I mean, it really gave me a different perspective on it. That's all.
Cisco is Mr. Rogers. Gotcha.
And Cisco's not Mr. Rogers, but he's there.
Close. All right. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Anyway,
Doesn't matter.
so I'm
Go on.
on to antagonist, and we have a picture of Freud up there, which is very fitting because the antagonist is your mother,
your father. I knew you were going to fucking do that. Good one, though.
It's about not being able to let go of past tragedies and the
Holding on to
impact
grief,
they have
yeah.
on, and not letting Mr. Rogers into your life in order to resolve you of your sins and allow you to transcend to a higher state in the land of make-believe.
Of emotional well-being.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, that is the... like, whether you think it's effective or not is up to you guys. I could actually... I'm wavering a little bit on this because it's a framework for the miracles of Rogers, more so than it is, I think, anything... I mean, it's well done, but I think it's generic to make it accessible, that everyone can go in and see kind of a tragedy in their own life played out here, whether it's the distant husband, the birth of a child causing rupture, the father
parents.
leaving you, the mother passing, all those kind of things. So I don't. Again, it's up to you. I want to hear what you guys have to say.
No, I mean, it's funny because, like, yes, that of course is the antagonist, and like it's doubly funny for me, or maybe ironic even, that I often will call that out and say it's one because it's such a universal thing that everyone can understand and, you know, sympathize with it, and certainly can feel it in their own life and as reflected in the film itself. But you're right, like, because it is so broad, yes, it's a force. It's there. It's what's certainly Lloyd feels antagonized by these struggles of, you know, adulting, if you will. But it's so spread out. Like, if I give it a 0, it's not because it's a lack or like a flaw in the film. It's because it's almost just a framing device, as you said, versus like an actual antagonistic element is the best way I can describe it. So I see your wavering. I was sort of kind of the same way. I tend to lean towards that mindset at this point, but I'm not opposed. I can certainly swing back to a 1, and with that, I will hear what you guys have to say about it.
Unless Steve has something to say, I was just going to say the reason I did bring up Star Trek before is because seriously, because
I don't want it to be serious.
Star Trek and science fiction are one of the things that you look to with ideals, and one of the things that attracted me to Deep Space Nine, what attracts me to a lot of modern science fiction, for better or worse, is when you question that utopia, when you question that ideal. And the thing is, as to Scott's point, you question that ideal in the most mundane ways every single day. And the thing is, it's kind of like, on the one hand, it's just like the antagonist in this is some kind of thing we all feel, and it's unfathomable, but it's also banal at the same time because we're all feeling with it. So I have no answer for you as to whether to give this a 0 or 1. I'm throwing this on to Steve-O because at the same time, I do know. But the thing is, I really wanted to draw on what I said before. It wasn't just to plug Star Trek, and I've got Spock as my avatar right here. But because that is my magical world of fantasy where I've got different, you know.
All right, Mr. Rogers.
I fully agree that is the antagonist. Obviously, there's no concrete person or, you know, thing that's being
aside from that,
the antagonistic force in this. It is a lot about the struggles between Lloyd and the other people in his life. Including Mr. Rogers at first. Like, he really is annoyed by him. Yeah, he's really annoyed by him in the beginning because he's like, nobody is this perfect, and he really wants him to fit into the mold of what he thinks is going to happen, and he's really thrown off by Mr. Rogers just asking him questions instead of answering the questions. But you're right. I don't know if it's enough to give antagonists a 1. And I think I'm probably going to give it a 0. I'm probably tipped a little bit on the scale by the fact that if I don't give antagonist a 0, I'm going to give this a 10, and I'm not sure if that's I'm not sure if that's quite what I want to do for this movie.
Out of a 10, but
no, I mean, I don't think it's a perfect movie. I think it's a very good movie. I want to give it a good score, but this is the part of the movie that I think is on our scale, most susceptible to not really living up to a 1 on the scale.
I will say.
And I think that I'm probably going to give it a 0 for that. On a, if there are definite circumstances where I could see giving an antagonist of this same caliber a 1 maybe, but I think that every other part of the movie is just as is much stronger than this part, and I'm probably going to give it a 0 here.
Not that I think that either more a tangible villain
would have worked better.
or
No.
even more.
I don't think it's worse for it not having a really strong antagonist. I think the movie's actually better for that because
I just think that I don't want to give this movie a 10. I want to give it a 9. So I'm going to find.
I mean, I see the backdooring thing, but I think I'm going to vote with the crowd as well. I could have, like, if you had made a case for a 1, like, and we're like
convincing,
like vehemently with it, I could have, like I said, I could have been swung either way. But I think at this point with the field, like it's like, again, not a problem with the movie per se, but it is not as much of a factor versus the rest of the elements that compose the movie. So.
And that's why I spoke before Steve-O, because you do aspire to this utopia, but I needed somebody remove me from the viscera.
We all hedged our bets. It's cool.
Yeah.
Stephen, on to protagonist.
That's true.
Yeah.
We let everything.
Like I said,
Steve-O,
I
you're the
voted with the
deciding
crowd.
factor.
Hey, I can decide sometimes, once in a while.
He's a decider.
Bravo.
Yeah, so I think Lloyd is the sole protagonist in this.
I think it's clear.
I think it's really funny because Tom Hanks is probably going to win Best Actor. And I don't know. Is he going to be best supporting, or whatever? And it doesn't matter.
He's best supporting in my heart.
We'll talk about that
I'll get to that in a second. But
in a few months, I guess. Actually, I don't know if he's whatever.
That's really strong praise.
Anyway, the protagonist is Lloyd. I think that he's a really strong protagonist in this, and I love his character arc, and I love kind of the ways that he interacts with each of the characters in this is completely different from all of the other characters' interactions that he has. Like, he's a very multifaceted character in the ways that he approaches the world. And I think a lot of that has to do with him being a journalist and like looking for the story in whatever way he needs to get it, like even when he's not quote unquote on the job. And also, his interactions with his father have a lot to do with what happened in the past, how his mother was treated. But I love all those different interactions. I really like his I don't want to call it a redemption arc, but his like arc to get past the hatred that he has.
I mean, it's partly one of it's
for his father. I feel like there were a lot of these types of movies in like the 90s, and you don't see a ton of them anymore. Like these, like, it's a decent movie, but it ends like feel good. Now it's kind of, I feel like a lot of movies now are like, yeah, his dad's gonna die, and he never said goodbye to him, and now he has to figure out how to live with that or whatever. But this being a Mr. Rogers movie, it kind of has to have that finality to the character, and have him have that.
Unless Mr. Rogers took out the entire family with a sniper rifle. It could have gone that direction.
From the house next door, just in their moment of pure happiness.
That's an alternate reality and a make-believe there. But
yeah, I mean, I'm going to give him a strong one. I've said enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about it. You covered a lot of it. I do. Matthew Rice, I believe, who's the actor's name who played
Reese.
Reese,
right?
Yeah. I think he did a damn good job. Like you said, he's very believable, and it was like interesting to see him like interact with his boss at work, with his editor, and like how he talks to her and how he talks to his wife and his dad and his dad's like special lady friend and so forth, and of course Mr. Rogers himself. So yeah, he was very all rounded. He had a good arc, believable, made sense. It was all complete from start to finish. Nothing was out of nowhere, nor did it swerve for any sense, and he did a really good job in that role.
It was actually a perfectly paced arc.
Yep.
All the transition believable. But I also want to say that he has to carry this movie as the protagonist, and he's playing against perhaps
the most beloved,
Hanks' best performance. I'm going to say since Castaway, and playing against that and holding your own is that I didn't feel that Tom Hanks could have easily
outacted him,
took over this entire movie, and he did. He was supposed to, but he held his own, and he was a memorable character over the course of this.
Pretty much agree.
The only thing I have to add is when they introduced his character, he was on the picture board, and I
thought that was a really clever device.
But it was a great device. But the thing is, they had this picture of him kind of like looking like he's like the surprise mugshot. So there was a comedic element to it, which kind of disarmed you at the beginning. I thought he was a really strong protagonist. And as I said with JoJo, this is and I think you alluded to it, Ian. This is a film, were it not very well balanced, that any one of these performances,
it could have tipped it
either Lloyd or Fred Rogers, could have tipped it to the point of insufferability. So, and predictability. So, yeah, I'm giving him a very strong one.
Yep. Same for me.
This is one for everyone. Scott, talk about Mr. Rogers, or Raj, as I like to call
Mr.
him.
Hank Raj. Yeah,
Talked about Raj.
So, like I said, so this is the funny. This isn't my quote, but I did like it. Like, you want to see a film of America's most beloved actor playing America's most beloved human, then this is the film for you. But as you mentioned, yes, we have our issues with Tom Hanks and the movies he's chosen to do in the past couple years. You're right there, Chris. Sorry. I didn't mean to, it wasn't that funny.
No, it was pretty right on the money.
But, I mean, yeah, it's accurate. That's why I had to say it. Like, all credit to wherever I saw that at. But, of course, he is, like, the focal point of the characters who revolve around Lloyd Vogel's life. And, yeah, he was definitely a standout. He could have easily overdone it, easily, like, again, swung one direction or another, which would have lessened the impact of it, lessened the performance. But I think he nailed it spot on, played it just well enough that it was a realistic portrayal, at least made the most sense to the relationship, to the character's arc. And yeah, and his family was fine. His wife, Andrea, her actress, I don't remember her name, sorry, like you have it there.
I don't have it.
All I'm saying is, like, they all did a good job. His father, he was in American Beauty, a couple other things. All of it was believable. I believe these people were his father, his sister's third wife, or third husband, or whatever.
And his dad's girlfriend.
Yeah, right. So, like, yeah, I believe this sort of, like, fractured family, and Mr. Rogers sort of, like, again, floats in on angel wings and sort of helps him through this difficult period and this difficult relationship that he's been struggling with, in fact, for a long time. So, yes, Hanks' performance as such, as the Raj, as whatever you just said, yeah, was fucking spot on, and it could have very easily gone awry, as we said. So, if nothing else, I think you have to give that a 1, and everyone else did a damn good job, too. So it's all well-rounded, well-performed, and secondaries probably one of the strongest aspects of the film.
I'm going to pull up Chris for a second. You were talking about 90s movies like this. Remember Heart and Soul?
I do not remember Heart and Soul. I don't think I ever saw that.
No, I'm on the one here. But it's the kind of thing.
Sorry, buddy.
Speaking of angels, but it's literally, I think, like ghosts or angels come down to help, like, a couple.
Oh shit! I do remember it now.
And that's like this is what it reminds me of, like that
Angels
kind
in the
of
outfield.
that kind of character to bring a fractured relationship back together.
Yeah.
Again, though, as I said, this is a classic thing. But what I like is that all the secondary characters really have distinct either looks to them or personality quirks that no one kind of fades into.
They're not just like curtain dressing.
Yeah. So they all feel believable, as you said. So I'm going to give it, not just for Tom Hanks, but for the cast in general.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. Very strong performance by Tom Hanks.
The only thing I'm going to add to that is that the no, I realized from Jojo Rabbit, I'm like, I have nothing to add, but that Tom Hanks Mr. Rogers as a supporting character was the perfect conduit between Lloyd, because a lot of this film is his internal struggle, whether it's from that fantasy where he's like imagining himself, which is we'll get to style, but which is a great scene where his wife comes out and she's singing, and the conduit between very real people. So they show Mr. Rogers as a very real person, and he's a real person. These are real people, but he's a perfect conduit between what's going on inside our protagonist's head and what's reality. And what's reality is just I agree with you guys. 1.
Yeah, very strong performance by Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers, and honestly, everybody else did. You guys have already talked about Mr. Rogers enough, I think. But Everybody else I thought did a really good job. Jerry, as Lloyd's father, has a pretty good arc. Andrea doesn't so much have an arc, but
She kind of like a
does-
mini one, I would say.
it is like well, no, I mean she's kind of like she's kind of Lloyd's rock, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's true.
Um,
yeah. That's fair.
But even Mr. Rogers' wife Joanne has like an interesting part to play. I love the scene where after he wakes up from passing out on the set of the show, he wakes up in Mr. Rogers' house, comes downstairs, and they're both playing the piano together.
And she's acting as conductor. Turn the sheet
but it's
music.
so fucking it's just one of those scenes that's like really surreal, but like in a nice way. Like, a lot of times you get these really surreal movies and there's like a dark twinge to them. This is like the Optimist's surreal,
Exactly.
flick.
It's a wholesome surreality.
Even though there is like a twinge of sadness throughout this whole movie, but I guess I'll talk about that in style. But yeah, I'm gonna give supporting characters a pretty strong one. Bill as Mr. Rogers,
Yes, good call.
Whatever he
Handler,
was,
producer friend.
was pretty good.
He
I
was
forget-
really great.
I forget his name, but the guy from 30 Rock.
And Just Shoot Me.
And Just Shoot Me, yeah.
I like how he takes over the handshake.
Yeah.
That's such a
he's
great.
like the
They
business
have this,
side
they're like,
of his-
check out this handshake.
Yeah,
He just takes it over.
the handshake handoff, I believe. That's what they said.
great.
He is amazing. I thought he was a great character.
Yeah, true. So got to give him credit. Yeah,
Give him
everyone
full credit.
else.
So it's
You
going
want
to
to
be
go
ones for
around?
me. Yep.
Chris, dialogue.
The dialogue was great. It was as much as we say to the being real, that these characters are very real. That Mr. Rogers is a flawed character, even though he is kind of like the ideal. It's a.
You're trying to drag Mr. Rogers down, Bull. Your commentary about it.
No. I think it's important again, this is why I brought Star Trek up and why Deep Space Nine is because when
Is that why?
Oh no, hold on a second. No. When you challenge your ideals, when you challenge those things you hold sacrosanct, when you challenge utopia, when you challenge these things, and you get to see the man behind
When you challenge the Klingons.
seeing that. No, not that's a different subject.
That's my
But,
ideal.
Well, if you're talking Deep Space Nine,
Now you've done it.
No. But there is an analogy to be had. For me, is that when you challenge these ideals, when you say like, "Hey, even in your ideal, these are flaws," and I think the dialogue, the verbal and the nonverbal, that everything had a payoff to it. To, as I mentioned before, to his wife saying like this is his coping mechanisms, to Mr. Rogers saying to Lloyd, these are my coping mechanisms. They all paid off. So I mean, dialogue was extremely natural, very real for these very real characters. But when you even entered the psychology of it, and when you were challenging your ideals and your expectations, they all had a verbal or nonverbal payoff to them. I have to give this a very strong one.
So while I disagree with the focus on the flawed aspects of Mr. Rogers, which was there, but capturing his essence while also making him that kind of surreal archetype there, I think they balanced that incredibly well. And that's where that they allowed the magical realism with a ground of reality of what we know about how Mr. Rogers behaved.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, the most important part, is capturing the dialogue, even when he's saying things that like are almost unbelievable for what a human would say, but it's made believable because it's
Because
Mr.
of that.
Rogers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
that's
the
really important,
capturing of
Chris,
his
Yeah.
language.
Yeah, he does feel like the type of person that just talked how he talked on his show. Because, and this is documented, like he never wanted to talk down to children. He always wanted to give them
level with them.
he wanted to tell them things in ways that they could understand. And like so he would bring up any subject and just break it down to its simplest component parts. And there's actually a really fascinating article out there, maybe I'll see if I can find it, but about he had like 18 rules that he did all of the dialogue on Mr. Rogers'
the show.
Neighborhood. That you had to pass like all of these rules with for any dialogue that was in it, and it's wild. It's a wild read. It's really fascinating. But
Share it in the comments.
I think that I'll see if I can dig that up.
Thought to throw it in there. Yeah.
Or
But-
description, whatever.
It's obvious that he went through life kind of trying to live by that, and so like you could tell anytime he's having a conversation with Lloyd or anytime he's having a conversation with anybody, and like Hanks pulls this off brilliantly, where he leaves space where he's like in his mind figuring out
The
exactly
appropriate
how to
things to-
say
yeah.
what he wants to say so that it comes across exactly how he wants it to come across. And like in all those silences, they add so much to the dialogue of this movie because you see what he's you kind of see him processing as he's trying to figure out what to say. And like there's one part of the film, and I'm going to bring it up here, where he's like, I like to, when I'm trying to figure something out, I like to take a moment of silence. And then you sit with them in silence for 1 minute in the movie, and the theater is dead silent as everyone in the diner that they're in comes to this silence. I thought it was a brilliant scene, and it's just makes what he's saying before and after that so much more powerful.
Yes.
In terms of how the dialogue works in this film. So I'm going to give dialogue a very strong one.
Yeah, for sure. I do not have much more to add. I just will basically back up everything you guys said. Yes, believable. There were moments where were it handled differently, it could have tipped again one way or the other into unbelievability or too much over a stylized, if you will, like too much of a caricature, I guess I want to say. But it was never that. So yeah, all throughout, it was grounded, but had again, sort of the more ethereal moments, I guess we'll say. But it all worked, and a very strong one, very damn solid one for dialogue for me. There were a couple funny jokes here and there too. Like it was humorous in various parts, like here and there throughout, and then to sort of break up the more dramatic, serious stuff that was happening, that was being said.
And the one thing I loved about the dialogue was there was no lecture. There was no like,
Yes,
here's my Oscar speech for the film. It was, I mean, they really,
Won't you give me an Oscar, neighbor?
Once,
Go on.
fuck you. That's awesome. No, but this, you want to talk about balance in this film? It would really have been easy. And I know you're going to hit this with style, but the scene in the Chinese restaurant, to make that a pontification rather than what you're going to get to, it would have been really easy.
Yeah.
Well, Steve-O started it already.
I know,
so.
Steve-O stole your shit.
You're all breaking my heart.
Stole your thunder. But
So I'm moving on to style now. I think we all give it ones. And this is the only thing I actually want to talk about. There's a lot you can talk about in style here, and it's actually fantastic. But they have perhaps, I think, one of the ballsiest scenes I've seen in a movie in a very long time. Mr. Rogers asks Lloyd for a minute of reflection. And there's a minute of silence in this film. It's a restaurant. Everyone in the restaurant goes silent. There's no score. Just 1 minute of silence with Mr. Rogers looking directly into the camera at the audience, at you, the person watching this. They bring it up earlier. Chris, you actually pointed this out to me. There he goes. I attempt to speak to the children in the audience directly. He's directly looking at you
and doing that,
asking you to reflect on people in your life for 1 minute of silence. Not 30 seconds, not 40, legitimately. And that is
a real-time
really
minute, we'll say.
uncomfortable thing to do in anything, whether you're doing radio, whether you're doing TV. Just having silence, reflective silence, and pulling it off is, I have to give this film complete credit for just something I haven't seen in maybe never, but in a very long time I haven't seen this.
And the thing I love about it is, at the beginning of that, he checks his watch. So there's an indicator like, we're going to be quiet now. And wait, so yeah, I agree with you on that one.
That actually, that scene reminded me of the end of Call Me By Your Name. Because it's like purely facial acting, but this does it in the middle of the frickin' movie. It's a really great scene. I love not only Hanks' acting in that scene, but also Lloyd is really good. And just a bunch of the other random patrons look as though they're like also musing about this same thing, and it's like I don't know. It was just a really affecting scene.
Yep, 100%.
But I also want to touch on, kind of the surrealist nature of a lot of this movie. That it starts off with like the Mr. Rogers picture board, and then there's Mr. Rogers like sets for scene transitions, which are incredible.
Yeah,
like so
pretty
much
fucking
detail
sweet.
put into them. And then there's just a scene where Lloyd is just in, an episode of Mr. Rogers. So I mean, there's a bunch more of that type of stuff. I guess I'm gonna pass it on so I don't steal everything that everybody's gonna say or whatever.
Yeah,
but.
I mean, you guys certainly covered some of the highlights, and I absolutely agree. The ballsy move there, like again, could have easily been mishandled or could have easily gone awry. I think it worked perfectly given the gravitas for the scene and the way it was done. I do want to go back to, I guess it ties into style and also a little bit back to dialogue a bit. You said something, Chris, where some of the nonverbal stuff was like as effective as a piece of dialogue there could have been, and I think that sort of again merges into style a bit. And yeah, for sure, Steve-O, it was really cool how they had the set, like the miniatures that look like the Mr. Rogers set that I'm familiar with, like depicting the cities, New York, Pittsburgh, where he's going, and like that was all used for transitional purposes. It was really cool. Like it added on, of course, to the aesthetic of it all. And yeah, it all looked great overall. I'm not sure if the soundtrack I noticed too much. Like, yeah, of course they're playing the Mr. Rogers songs like that, and there's actually a very nice touching scene. Like when they're taking the subway and everyone on the train notices that it's Mr. Rogers and they sing the theme song. And that was very heartwarming.
That scene was touching in the way that the scene from Darkest Hour, where Winston Churchill's on the train,
yes, sure.
was not.
Yeah, it was the opposite of that.
Yeah,
Like,
really funny. That scene, I was like, "This is fucking bullshit."
I was about to.
I can't believe you remembered that
on
from
the scene
Darkest Hour.
on the scene with Mr. Rogers.
Exactly.
On the scene with Mr. Rogers, I was like, I bet you people did this to him like all the fucking time when he was fucking riding the subway.
Inspired
all
by
those,
a
like,
tale.
hardcore guys in the back who,
Yeah.
because that goes to the surreality of it. Like everyone on the subway,
Like the children start doing it, and the cops are doing it. But yeah.
Darkest Hour. I immediately first thought of like which one are you talking about, the science fiction one or the one?
No.
And when you said when Churchill's on the train, I'm like, oh please do not. And when you said this was everything that wasn't, I'm like, all right on the money.
That's really funny, but I can't believe you even recalled that scene.
Yeah,
from
I was
Darkest
gonna
Hour.
say me too. I can't believe that was a nice little callback.
But regardless, the style is very top notch, very well done, and very clever and creative and unique, and works for the whole story. So
I agree. I loved the most of the exteriors being the facade, the models, the miniatures.
Mhm.
And I do have to say that again, this is a film about balance. This is a film where even the train scene where they're singing could have been pushed over to like maudlin.
Yeah.
We could have had it was really funny because one of the things that made me think about, they really could have gone into the lecture thing at the end of Two Towers where Sam gives that whole thing, that whole speech, and they're and it's just like it was so unnecessary. And like this could have really done one of those anthem kind of speeches or those anthem kind of moments, but they balanced everything
like
out.
a Winston Churchill speech.
Like a Winston Churchill speech. But then
neighbors, we'll fight them on the beaches and so forth.
So I mean, the balance in this film is really well balanced, and this could have very easily gone in one direction or the other.
Well,
All right.
Bring it on home.
Yep. Recommendation, Steve-O, we start with you.
yeah. Go see A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Mariel Heller does another great job.
Give her a shout out.
in her newest directorial, outing. I don't know what the right word
That
was.
outing was good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested to see what she comes up with next, and it's a deftly handled movie. Hanks is great. Matthew Reese is great, and yeah, check it out.
I'm going to steal a phrase from you. Like, oddly enough, I do recommend it. Again, on paper, we were like, sure, it's going to be a motherfucking Oscar film, so we're going to go see it. But now having talked it out and enjoyed it, yes, I would recommend it.
Hope it is.
It's not what you think. Yeah, I hope it does make the cut for sure. It's not what you might think on paper. It's better than that, and in fact, has a lot of meaningful, powerful things to say without mishandling it, without going, again, too far in one direction or the other to pull you out of it. So, hell yeah. Very strong recommendation for me.
In a year of a lot of forgettable films, this is a treat. This is a treat that we walked. I think I can speak for all of us. When we walked in, we thought it was going to be some kind of maudlin Oscar bait biopic.
Masturbatory bullshit, yeah.
Yeah.
But
I'm an Oscar baiter. No, this is.
Hanks usually is.
Yeah, I'm going to say I give this a very strong recommendation.
I was shocked.
Shocked.
Because I agree with all of you. I was not looking forward to seeing this film. It did something original. It did something, but while steeped in tradition, it took a classic plot, updated it for modern times, and made Mr. Rogers interesting. And not to say he's not, but like they took it in a direction I didn't think they would.
Exactly.
And did something fresh with it. And I actually, as of right now, this is my pick for Best Picture. Even though I think there are more movies to my taste out there, I think if
from amongst the likely field, this one's.
I think that this is a good chance of making it because it's also an optimistic movie in a time. I think. So, see what you pointed out, Harley. This is an optimistic movie in a time where optimism is out of fashion, and I think that a lot of people will be drawn to the fact that of a calling back to a better day when Mr. Rogers was being a triumph and inspiring people. And I think that, so I give this full recommendation. So we give this movie a 9. I think the only detraction is antagonist, because I don't think any of us want to give this a 10.
No, it wasn't really detraction. It's just a weaker-ish point of it, and not really the point of the film.
It's like saying life is an antagonist. That would be
and like I said, I usually do give that a 1, but in this case,
it's just way too general.
I mean,
but
Mr. Rogers proves that life doesn't need to be antagonist. We can
you can overcome that.
We can all carry the cross as well as he does.
And I love the subversion in that I walked into here thinking that the reporter was going to be the entranceway into Fred Rogers' life, and it turned out to be the opposite.
Yeah, the framing
Fred
device.
Rogers was the entranceway into his own life.
Yeah,
exactly.
So it was a lovely subversion.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right. Yep. Well, what would Rogers do? He would introduce Stephen Ramosi, or say farewell, Stephen Ramosi.
Goodbye, neighbor.
Scott Thill.
Until next time, neighbors.
And Christopher Morgan.
Live long and prosper, peace and long life, neighbor.
Good
None
night.
of you are my neighbors.
Good night.
Editing and engineering by Christopher Morgan. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates. Or Mott's?